EVO.
Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised.
It's supply and demand. It just won't stop. And so that's why I say, when people ask, well, the drug war, is it really working? Well, it has to work. We have to fight it. Because if we don't, then, we're in for bad times.
Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Brandon. You're listening to episode 168, The Murder of Enrique Camarena Salazar.
Operation Leyenda, Leyenda, Leyenda. That is DEA's operation that sought to bring all of those involved to justice.
On this week's episode, we're going to go over 2 different cases with the help of our special guest.
Great. Okay, so Mike, it is so great to talk to you, but how would you like me to refer to you in the show?
It's a pleasure to be, meeting you.
Mm-hmm.
I've read a bit about you, so I know that, it's a privilege and an honor to be, on your show. And so my name is Mike Chavarria, and I spent a career with the Drug Enforcement Administration. I retired in 2017 after about 32 and a half total years. I retired as a group supervisor. My career took me all over the world. Well, the Western Hemisphere, pretty much Latin America. I started out got hired in San Diego in 1985, went to the DEA's Academy. We shared that with the FBI at the time. And then I went to work, and DEA sent me to Bolivia, South America, to Costa Rica, Central America, and 2 places in Mexico, Guadalajara, which is the capital of the state of Jalisco, and then Mexico City. I ended my career in Houston, Texas.
The so-called war on drugs is very complicated, but one thing is clear. It's fueled by 2 things: consumption and greed.
There's a kind of a saying I like, is that there are 2 insatiable appetites going on here. There's one for the consumption of drugs in this country, and there's an insatiable appetite for the money it generates south of the border. That's what keeps things going.
Now, a little history lesson. In the 1970s, the primary source countries of cocaine were Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. So basically, they had the product, but they didn't have a system of transport to get their cocaine into the United States. So that's where the Mexicans came in. They were the traffickers, which consisted of brokering deals and then overseeing the safe transportation of the illicit drugs into the United States. And then conversely, they used the same transportation network to get the money back to South America, which they'd get a small cut of.
During the 70s and the 80s, the Colombians just merely paid the Mexicans for facilitating the transfer.
But that would change with the creation of the Guadalajara Cartel, who would totally flip the script.
When you go back to the 60s and the 70s, there really were 2 groups operating as drug trafficking organizations. You got the Gulf and everything on the West. Mm-hmm. And they got along. And the government basically, all right, do your thing. We get a little money and everybody, gets along. Don't cause us as a country any embarrassment or give us any reason to put our foot down. That was fine and dandy. Then a guy by the name of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo came along in the late 70s, and he was a visionary. He was a brilliant man and decided that he could grow a cartel and gave it a name, Guadalajara Cartel, because most of these traffickers were from the mountains of Sinaloa. So they moved from Sinaloa to Guadalajara, formed the Guadalajara Cartel, and proceeded to grow their business. That's when they established relationships with the Colombians. That's when they decided that that would take a bigger payment from servicing or being subordinated by the Colombians. They would start being paid in cocaine as opposed to cash. Cash was always late. They waited for cocaine to make its way through the United States, get up to the distribution markets in the United States, and they had to wait for money to come back down. Well, Mexicans got tired of waiting. So they decided to take the bull by the horns and demand payment in the form of cocaine. That's when the Mexican drug cartels started to grow. And they were empowered and able to work and smuggle drugs with impunity.
Now, back in the early 80s, the Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA, was still a fledgling organization. It was created in 1973 to combat drug trafficking in the United States, and they were under a lot of pressure. In October of 1982, President Reagan had a speech where he declared a war on drugs. He also added that illicit drugs were a threat to U.S. national security. And around the same time, Nancy Reagan started touring schools talking about substance abuse prevention. In 1984, when she was asked by a schoolgirl, after one such talk, "What should I do if I was approached by someone offering drugs?" And Nancy Reagan replied, "Just say no." Obviously, the expectation was that the DEA would staunch the flow of drugs entering the United States, and for that, they looked to special agents like Enrique Camarena Salazar, or Kiki, which was his nickname. Kiki was a Mexican-born American. He served in the Marines from 1973 to 1975, and after that, he became a police officer in California. From there, he ended up joining the DEA in 1977. In 1981, he was offered a job at the DEA's Guadalajara office, where Kiki was a huge asset. As a fluent Spanish speaker, he was also super charismatic, and right away he started cultivating sources within the Guadalajara Cartel, but also the Mexican police force and beyond. The DEA's mission is to amass sources that help you gather evidence to put together cases, which is exactly what Kiki was able to do. Because of his work, the DEA was able to seize the international bank accounts of high-up cartel drug lords. But also through his informants, Kiki was able to infiltrate the Guadalajara Cartel to such an extent that he got the coordinates for their biggest marijuana plantation. Kiki and a DEA pilot searched from high above in the sky and found a place known as El Buffalo Ranch. In November of 1984, the Mexican army, based on Kiki's intelligence and with the assistance of the DEA, raided El Buffalo Ranch. Law enforcement torched thousands of tons of marijuana. In fact, the seizure was estimated to be worth billions and reportedly represented at that time a third of the United States marijuana supply. Obviously, a huge win for the DEA. However, the blow to the Guadalajara cartel was massive, specifically to the cartel boss, Rafael Caro Quintero. It wasn't long before Quintero had tracked back the intelligence to Kiki, and he vowed revenge, specifically against the special agent who had single-handedly infiltrated the Guadalajara cartel. Quintero set up a meeting with the top cartel bosses. Not only did he want revenge against Kiki, but he also wanted to send a message to the United States. And he got the green light to do so. A few months after the raid, on that marijuana plantation, the cartel struck back. Under the advisement of the cartel, a handful of corrupt Mexican police officers abducted Kiki off the street at gunpoint.
In February of 1985, they went after an agent by the name of Enrique Kiki Camarena Salazar. They kidnapped him, abducted him in broad daylight, not even a block away from the consulate, U.S. consulate. They took him about a mile and a half away.
He was bound, blindfolded, and before they began to interrogate and torture him, one of his captors pressed the play button on a tape recorder and recorded the torture that went on for more than 30 hours. They wanted to know what he knew about the cartel and their relationship with Mexican officials.
They tortured him, interrogated him, and then they killed him. They buried him alive. It was just a tragic moment for DEA for the
Wait a
world
second. Wait a second.
to
They
see.
buried him alive?
Yeah, of the information from the folks that did the autopsy. I mean, their interrogation is so brutal. It's not even appropriate to describe.
They also tortured and murdered Kiki's DEA pilot who had helped him find the marijuana plantation. Kiki's body was found wrapped in plastic in a rural part of Mexico a month after his kidnapping in March of 1985. When his body was recovered, Kiki's face had been crushed and a hole had been drilled through his skull. Those were just some of his injuries. And the brazen abduction and murder of a United States DEA special agent not only shocked law enforcement, but the American people. This level of violence toward an honorable man who wanted to help stop the destructive force of drugs on people's lives really struck a chord. What the Guadalajara Cartel obviously hadn't expected or planned for was that Kiki's murder became a defining moment in the United States war on drugs, not a cowering point. Kiki became a symbol of sacrifice and righteousness. And what the cartel had done to him in retribution and to protect their drug empire, it prompted Operation Leyenda, which would become the largest DEA homicide investigation into Kiki's murder.
He was born in Mexico, Mexicali, so he was Mexican American, and they knew that he was collecting information on the Guadalajara Cartel. He and his colleagues in the office were developing a lot of information that was being passed on up the chain, and that information was being translated to headquarters. And they were reporting not only on the drug trade, on the drug trafficking, but on the corruption. And so Mexican traffickers found out and corrupt counterparts from the government that we were reporting on them. Much of our intelligence information led to significant seizures. So they felt the pinch from the seizures that originated from our information. And they saw this as an opportunity to grab an agent who had been there for 6 years. He was a Spanish speaker. They looked at him as a traitor because he was a Mexican American, and they felt like they could get the most information out of him, and they did. They pulled a lot of information out of him before they killed him. And they underestimated us because they didn't realize that, we would respond the way we did.
Yeah, what was the response?
Well, we went after all of we sent agents down there. We did what we do best. We cultivate sources, informants, not only working in the community, but within the police. We developed a very solid picture of what generated the conspiracy, the plot to grab our agent. We figured it all out, and then we started like a surgeon, and we focused in on certain targets, and we went after them one by one. The immediate target was Rafael Caro Quintero. He was grabbed after he escaped from Guadalajara, Mexico to Costa Rica. We had him picked up in Costa Rica, and he was jailed within a month of the abduction. Then Ernesto Fonseca, Carrillo, those are the three masterminds of the Guadalajara Cartel. And the three of them were involved in also masterminding the plot to kidnap our agent. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, I mentioned him. He was the visionary. Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and then Rafael Caro Quintero.
So the investigation led to the arrest and conviction of multiple high-ranking members of the Guadalajara Cartel and their associates in both Mexico and the United States, including Quintero, who was convicted in Mexico in 1985 and sentenced to 40 years. But the investigation also exposed something unexpected. Basically, a fractured relationship between the CIA and the DEA in the form of potentially divided loyalties and priorities. So a little bit of background. The DEA and CIA operated separately, but they also worked together on cases, or at least on paper they were supposed to. But Kiki's murder and the subsequent investigation revealed that their agendas were at odds. Both agencies worked to protect America's interests, but they had very different agendas. The CIA's focus was on secret intelligence gathering. Agents carry out operations in other countries solely for the purpose of protecting national security. That's their first priority, which means they don't always share that intelligence with law enforcement agencies like the DEA. Whereas the DEA is a law enforcement agency whose mission is to investigate drug trafficking, gather evidence for cases, which then hopefully will lead to arrests and prosecution of criminals. Their goal is to dismantle the cartels and winning the war on drugs. However, during Operation Leyenda, the gaps in both intelligence sharing and varying priorities became evident. And the CIA came under scrutiny because it was alleged that members of the cartel had become valuable sources of intelligence for the CIA on other secret missions that weren't necessarily related to the drug trade. And as a result, the CIA had been protecting those sources and not turning them over for prosecution. I mean, it just wasn't a good look. Americans expected these law enforcement agencies that were created to protect Americans, especially ones like Kiki, an agent who put himself at risk to stop drugs from entering into the United States. Kiki's murder put a face on drug trafficking, the human cost, the father of three who lost his life in the line of duty. And what do we owe someone like Kiki, who, when asked to help take down the Guadalajara Cartel and made a big swing toward that, going against the most ruthless cartel leaders, if you do that, you want to know that these agencies like the DEA and CIA have your back. His death wasn't just an attack on one heroic agent, but it was also a message from the cartel, a warning to the United States that no one was safe, and the powerful cartel wasn't afraid of the mighty superpower. It was also a stark reminder of the true cost of the war on drugs, a multi-billion-dollar industry fueled mostly by the United States' insatiable need for illicit drugs and the devastating ripple effect in its wake. People and families torn apart by addiction and violence.
Mexico perceives it as a U.S. problem, and based on what you said, I've just been thinking about it, and it's true. The demand is coming from the U.S. Why do you think, I'm so curious as someone on the front lines of it, why are we so numbing ourselves? Have you figured out why this demand? Why us? I mean, of course, there's Europe and Japan. I think you had mentioned those countries in your book, but the U.S., what is it about us that we just have to have these drugs? Or is that too big of a question to ask?
It's a complicated question, but I think it boils down to simple things like disposable income. We all, watch the stock market every day. We all have 2 or 3 cars, TVs in every room. It all started out, at least with the cocaine, to be a celebrity party favor, right? Everybody in a celebrity get together, they were doing lines of coke, and then it was, the prices were held such that the middle incomer could also splurge. At one point, it was $100 a gram. To this day, the drug trade keeps prices for drugs at a level where the supply is always plentiful.
Yeah, and then now with fentanyl, how does that come into play with it was for the celebrities, then it's middle classers can afford it as a party drug, and now it's fentanyl and the devastation that it's wrought on this country. What are your thoughts on that?
Ungodly devastation in this country. Many of the fentanyl deaths are overdoses. People don't know, generally speaking, what they're getting. Fentanyl is hidden in pills and even cocaine. Much of cocaine that's coming into this country, and heroin is laced with fentanyl. It is, fentanyl today was methamphetamine 10, 15, 20 years ago. A synthetic drug that is easy and cheap to make and very profitable for the drug traffickers that produce it. Produce it for, I'm figuratively speaking here, pennies to the dollar, making hundreds of dollars at the consumer end. It's supply and demand. It just won't stop. And so that's why I say, when people ask, well, the drug war, is it really working? Well, it has to work. We have to fight it because if we don't, then we're in for bad times.
So earlier, Mike mentioned the capture and conviction of the cartel leader, Rafael Caro Quintero, back in the mid-1980s for Kiki's murder. Well, he had been released on a technicality in 2013, but was recaptured in 2022. Now, in February of 2025, Quintero was extradited to the United States, where he pleaded not guilty to Kiki's murder, as well as conspiracy and leading a criminal enterprise. He's currently being detained without bail pending trial.
Rafael Caro Quintero was recently extradited to the United States to stand trial for his crimes. 2025, and we're still seeking justice.
Now, in the beginning of this episode, I talked about another case. Mike has a new book that just came out. It's called Junior, a Son of the Gulf Cartel. The story's about Junior, a highly successful Mexican cartel broker who trafficked 47 tons of cocaine into the United States before he got caught and was pulled into a conference room at a children's hospital in Houston where he was seeking medical treatment for his daughter. It's here that Mike was able to flip Junior, the son of a high-ranking member of the Gulf Cartel, and got him to agree to be a confidential informant for the DEA. Now, I'm not going to lie. I clocked Mike's easy way and smile at the very beginning of our interview, which is why I left it in at the top of the show. I'm talking about this right here.
Great. Okay. So, Mike, it is so great to talk to you, but how would you like me to refer to you in the show?
It's a pleasure to be, meeting you.
Mm-hmm.
I've read a bit about you, so I know that, it's a privilege and an honor to be, on your show. And so my name is Mike Chavarria.
Mike's compliments are something that I brought up later in the interview.
Is more about the human relationships that exist, the agents and their informants, the agents and other agents, the bureaucracy, and the informants and their drug traffickers that they're targeting. And so it's drug trafficker interaction with drug trafficker, informant interaction with controlling agents, and then the agents' interaction with other agents. So you get the whole picture in this book as to how, an under the hood look, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was fascinating because just as you started the conversation with a compliment, I was, of course, loving it. It immediately disarmed me. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm in for it. Here's a DEA agent. Here's someone who knows how to get my guard down.
But honestly, Mike's book is about so much more than drug trafficking and the cartel. It's the flip side of the coin. Our first case was the murder of Kiki, a heroic DEA special agent, someone who put his life on the line to do the right thing. And in Junior's case, he surprisingly became a hero in a totally different way.
Of course, there's the humanity of it. Obviously Junior was born into the trade. And, there's a description of his father taking him to the different, this is how you test it. And this is how, it's like a father taking their son to play football and then to his small business. And it's like, it's so relatable, and then of course he wants to do a really good job and he becomes like 40 tons later. And then once he becomes an informant, he wants to do a really good job for you guys. So like given a different set of circumstances, I'm sure Junior would have been someone that could have been your partner.
That's a good point. No, you hit it. You hit it right on the head. He started out a bad guy, right? But shortly into it, he warmed our hearts. What can I say? It's not something DEA frowns upon that. Why? Because it's for our own protection of our case, ourselves, ethics. It's an ethic issue because generally speaking, these people are natural born criminals. Mm-hmm. They grow up criminals and they die criminals. Do people change? Yeah, but not always.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
People don't wake up one day and just all of a sudden decide to be different, but triggers, things that happen in your life, trigger change. Mm-hmm. And they did in Junior's case. And we saw that. We saw it as he became vulnerable. I realized this guy, he wants to change. Mm-hmm. And maybe it was karma. I don't know, but something scared him. And I love his family for his family overrode his criminal career.
Well, and I think you did a really good job of like the first interrogation. I was like, oh shit, this is crazy. Oh my gosh, I don't, when he was picked up and they hit him in one side of the head, hit him on the other side of the head, then like, did the waterboarding, and I was like, and knocked his tooth loose, and it was very immediate and real. And then right before he goes to take his daughter to get this operation, he's picked up and like, living that kind of life where you can just be picked up at any moment and then you don't know what's going to happen. They're either going to kill you, beat you to a pulp, and then maybe set you free. Like that has got to be awful to live like that, so to have this potential like escape, I'm sure that, like you said, it was a trigger of like, maybe this is, he wasn't so far gone into the violence. I mean, he was like a middle person, right? So that's different from someone who's like a killer or a sociopath, or, you know what I mean? As a broker, it feels like it wasn't, he was making the deals. He wasn't enforcing the deals, right?
He wasn't necessarily the kingpin, what I call the kingpin investor, although he did invest. That was part of being his role as a broker. He was intermediating major multi-ton smuggling ventures between Colombian sources and the Mexican kingpin investors. And he would orchestrate the whole thing. He'd put transporters to work, not only from Central America to Mexico, but from Mexico to the United States. He had his fingers all over the place. And while on one hand, it was lucrative, on the other hand, it was extremely dangerous, because when things went wrong, and they always do, the drug world, there's a saying in DEA, shit happens.
Yeah.
And it does. When shit happens for a broker like Junior, someone's got to pay. There's no surviving that world. If you survive it, God, you're riding around with angels on your shoulder. But most people don't survive it.
Here's the rest of my interview with Mike, and stick around because we cover a lot of ground. We talk about the book, but he doesn't want to give away the ending, which I totally understand. I've read it, and it is excellent. A really unvarnished look inside the drug trade in a way I've never heard before. This is not the Hollywood version.
But I'm going to read you a quote, and I have it
From
titled
Pie in
under
the Sky
here,
Media,
Born into the
Criminal
Business.
Mischief
This is
an
from your
EVO
book.
production.
Quote,
recorded live. in the
this is
beautiful
how
Pacific
Beto and I
Northwest.
have been so
We're produced
successful,
by
Junior
Brandon
said,
Morgan and
adding,
myself.
we get paid by
Music by
everyone, no matter
Soundstripe.
the cartel
For EVO
affiliation.
Creative,
Junior
I'm
laughed at
Carolyn
how the
Osorio,
DEA liked to
your writer
describe
and
cartels in a
host.
cookie cutter way. He said, my father told me that you all gave us that name, cartel. He said, we didn't call ourselves anything except families and clans. So like that really stood out to me, because I think that people, or maybe I'll just leave it with myself, like you think of cartel, you don't necessarily think of family and clans. I think of like brutality, money. Like talk a little bit about that from your perspective.
If we all go all the way back to the 50s and 60s, and even 70s, they were family run. They weren't necessarily cartels or organized in a fashion that we have seen in more modern times, but they were literally run by kingpins or drug lords who were seen as Robin Hoods. They took care of the town, they built churches, they built schools. They were seen in a positive light for the drugs that they smuggled into the United States. A lot of what they did was they cultivated communities for support. They were friends with local police, state police, local politicians, and so in that regard, that's what I was referring to. And Junior knew that, and in fact, both Junior and his best friend Beto, they both realized, because their families were both in the drug business for decades. In the 70s, the drug trade began in Colombia. For those fans of Netflix series Narcos, they're familiar with Pablo Escobar and his Medellin cartel and the cartel that followed, which is the Cali cartel. Now, that story came to light on the television, but the story really comes from those who are on the front lines, on the ground in Colombia, fighting the drug war. And in Colombia, it was a drug war. They were chasing Pablo Escobar around, and he was threatening the entire country. So the agents that brought that to life, I can name them because they all have books that I would highly recommend as good reads. You've got Javier Pena, Steve Murphy. They wrote the book Manhunters. And then there's Chris Feistel and Dave Mitchell, colleagues and friends, who wrote the book After Escobar. So both very good books that give a lot of that detail. So that was the birth of the cocaine trade. And the guys that formed the cartels, in this case in Colombia, they weren't businessmen. They were common criminals, thugs, who realized the lucrative capabilities that cocaine as a commodity was. And so they started growing their businesses. And before you knew it, they were overnight billionaires, sending massive, and I mean ton quantities, into our country by way of the Caribbean corridor. Most of this cocaine, and there are plenty of shows, movies about how the cocaine was making its way into Florida. And they were causing violence on the streets in our country, primarily Florida. So the U.S. reacted. We got our law enforcement involved, and we started to stem the flow of the cocaine coming through the Caribbean corridor. Well, that went from the 70s all the way through, I want to say, as late as the early 90s, when the Colombians realized, hey, we need to change things up. So that corridor shifted from the Caribbean to Mexico. During that period of time, and I'm talking about it started in the late 80s and early 90s, the Mexicans got involved, but they were subordinated by the Colombians, who were the sources for the cocaine. The Mexicans were the facilitators, and they were taking payment for facilitating the transport of the cocaine through Mexico into the United States. They were also responsible for corrupting local, state, federal law enforcement and politicians and the military to help move this cocaine through without, intervention. Within a short period of time, the Guadalajara Cartel that was formed by Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Rafael Caro Quintero, they were the authors of what became the abduction, murder of our DEA agent Camarena in 1985. Well, that was the beginning of the end of that cartel. But they had already created a scenario in Mexico that started to produce kingpins, Mexican-based kingpins in Mexico. The Mexicans basically took over the cocaine trade. Okay, they stopped receiving payment. They demanded half of every load of cocaine that was brought into Mexico from the Colombians. They demanded half of that load. And from that moment on, and I'm talking the late 80s into the 90s to where we are today, they essentially pushed Colombia out of Mexico, and they took over the drug trade. Now, from that period of time, fast forward all these decades, now the Mexicans are a global threat, not just with cocaine. It started with cocaine because that's where everyone in Mexico, from the drug traffickers to the politicians, realized the lucrative capabilities that cocaine had, much more than marijuana and heroin. But now Mexico is a source for marijuana, heroin, cocaine. And now what's really threatening this country are the synthetic drugs, methamphetamine and really fentanyl is what is coming into this country, in massive quantities.
I was really interested and struck by all these shipments, which is a lot of cocaine, but also cash. How you get the cocaine in, and then how you get the cash out, and how they expect losses because there's so much of it going on. But then the structure of how, for example, in your book, Junior was getting into debt because of talk about that relationship between the drug dealers kind of buying into a shipment, and they're on the hook for it too, and then kind of like, if things go awry, they have to pay for it. And this is millions and millions of dollars. I always, I guess, kind of had the idea that you have this kingpin or like a Pablo Escobar. He's kind of controlling everything, and if it's his loss, it's his loss. But no, that's not how this works, right?
That's correct. So things, evolved over the years, and what we learned from the when things shifted from the Caribbean corridor into Mexico, the dynamic and interaction between the Colombians and the Mexicans started to evolve. And as the Mexicans became more dominant in that, industry and that business, things started to, the dynamics started to become a little bit more of a model of what we see today. And so what the Colombians would do is they would send their representatives into Mexico. And sometimes the Mexicans would send their representatives to Colombia, right? To not only serve as kind of like hostages in the event something went wrong, they could grab somebody and hold them responsible, but to make sure the flow of communication was clear, right? Mm-hmm. And commitments were made, monies were advanced, depending upon who you were as a drug trafficker in Mexico, would determine how much money you had to pay the Colombians in advance to get the cocaine on a ship, right? Or in a plane. And in this case, when this case came along, we as DEA, me personally, I learned an awful lot. I learned what the role of the broker was. And that's what Junior was. Junior was a broker. And he was brought into the business with a helping hand of a Colombian broker. And the two of them started to broker megaton shipments. And the reason why that function was so lucrative is because they were getting paid not only to link Colombian sources with Mexican investors / kingpins, but they were getting paid to hook up transporters as well. And during this era of time, and I'm talking about 90s into, after the new millennium, we were talking about various large-scale investors joining in on one shipment. Now, why would they do that? You get 10,000 kilos or 10 tons, right? Moving on board a ship or in a maritime crate cargo shipment, and what they wanted to reduce the risk. Mm-hmm. They wanted to. So if one drug trafficker was bringing in 2,000, another drug trafficker 3,000, and so on. And if something happened, no fault of anybody's, well, they weren't out, 10 tons. They were out 2 tons. So much cocaine was flowing into our country. And it was such a multi-billion-dollar business that they could absorb these losses. Now, having said that, every time there was a loss, either through accident or, intervention from law enforcement or from other bad guys, other traffickers, they would conduct their own investigation. And if they determined there was a rat in the woodpile, they would go after him. In this case, if it were mistakes that were made, they would enslave people like the broker or the transporter and turn them into their little, minion employees and say, you're going to work this off until you've earned both the credit and the money that was lost back. So in Junior's case, he moved so much cocaine as well as his Colombian broker. They had so much credit, they could lose a couple loads and it was not a big deal.
Now, so, just to get specific with Junior, when you got him to convert him to his nickname was 007, right? Which he was happy to have. But you went over in a hotel and you were interviewing him and he had to give every single deal that he did. And then you guys, were able to do the research and back it up. But it was 42 tons of cocaine that he brought, that he was a part of. What was that?
47.
47.
47 tons. That he counted 1 kilo at a time, and it all added up from the time he took the job as a broker. He helped facilitate all that cocaine right into our country. That was the only condition to allow him to cooperate with some kind of immunity. And frankly, it took its toll on him. At that 47th ton, he realized the ugliness of it all, of his dastardly deeds. And so it was a lot of cocaine. And that just goes to show you, this is one guy dealing with certain cartels. The astounding amounts of cocaine that were coming into this country, someone's comprehension.
But what was fascinating is how quickly each of them turned. In the movies, when you see them holding out and no way, I've got my brotherhood, it feels like they all turned pretty quickly. Beto, I know I'm pronouncing that wrong. How do you pronounce it?
Yeah, his close associate and best friend was Beto, and
Beto
that's a pseudonym.
and Lamona, like these guys all caved pretty quickly. So like if you could infiltrate and get enough on them, they would fold, it seems like pretty easily, although Lamona was very manipulative and he was able to manipulate. I think this is the sociopathic component. He was actually able to manipulate your counterparts, right?
Yes, other agents. We frequently work on a case, common targets. In this case, we all part of the same operation. We may have different informants that are recruited at a different time, and they may actually be criminal associates. In this case, they were. They knew each other quite well. They worked together closely, but they were recruited at different times by different individuals. And once we all knew that we had these informants recruited, the goal in our case, at least in the case of the Houston DEA's Houston office, was we wanted to use both of those informants to keep them honest. So we wanted to hold them accountable for their actions. We wanted to task them to infiltrate these common targets, and we wanted them reporting back to us. Ideally, we were hoping they would report on one another, and that would tell us who was being loyal to the controlling the DEA and who was working the other side. And that is a very typical thing with lifetime criminal informants. They're not going to just say, okay, you got me, now I'm going to do everything you'd like me to. They have come up in a criminal world. They're criminals, and unless deep down they want to change, they're going to continue to conduct criminal activity. In this case, let me tell you, the Colombians were masters at it. In fact, Colombians would send spies into us as informants to determine what we were up to and how strong of a case we had. That was not uncommon. So when in Lamona's case, he was sent down into Mexico, and I like to use this analogy, but not to be insulting, but there's a long leash with a lot of latitude. It was difficult to stay on top of an informant in Mexico when he was allowed to travel all around. We had to trust but verify as best we could what he was up to. In our case with our informant, Junior, we were able to get control over him and get him committed to the DEA's mission. For the U.S. government, we needed to do that. And we needed to get him to where, not compromised, but committed to a point where he knew he was already working for the government, developing incriminating information against his associates, his friends, etc. He needed to know there was no turning back.
Mm-hmm.
But there was always that possibility. But in Junior's mind, we saw, a commitment. We didn't trust that commitment. That's why we had to record every single thing he was doing, both in writing and over the phone. And those were called consensual recordings, where we had legitimate legal authorization to record his communications with targets of our investigation. And we quickly realized, hey, this guy, he's doing what we've asked him to do.
I mean, he's doing it with relish. He relished it because he saw he would get immunity for him and his family, it sounds like, right? So that was very powerful buy-in for someone who had grown up in this business and, really it sounds like wanted to get out of it and had, he'd been pulled off the street with a mask over his head and beaten, and like he saw the writing on the wall, like this is not going to end well for me, it seems like.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. In his early days, he experienced some of the brutality that goes along with the drug world, the underworld, and that was in Mexico. So he had already experienced the ugliness of, and if you could say, the eventuality of what might happen, live by the sword, die by the sword. But what really turned him around was the loyalty and love he had for his family. And that's what pushed him to, betray, if I could use that word, the criminal oath he took and the admiration and loyalty he had for his father,
Mm-hmm.
who basically brought him up in that world. So it was a bit of a soul searching role for Junior, but he did it.
Well, what's interesting, I think we talked a little bit about this before, but I want to just bring it up. Lamona was from Colombia. So he was an informant from Colombia. That was part of the half of the pie from your point of view. The other half of the pie, Junior, being from Mexico. So then you have listening ears. So it's really giving you an advantage to know both sides of that. And then they don't know about each other and they're business partners. They're complete business partners, right? So it's a really powerful dynamic. And then you have the DEA in Florida who's managing Lamona, and you're in Houston managing Junior.
Junior.
And there's this battle going on in the book between, and there shouldn't be, and you wouldn't think that there would be. Actually, we all know that this happens where turf wars are happening within your own organization. So that kind of brings me to my next question. Junior became a part of your band of brothers kind of mentality. And it was a slow, but he developed trust with you all, and he put the same effort of getting these 47 kilos into the United States and making all this money into basically giving you what you needed to bring charges and bring down this network of drug dealers, right? Talk a little bit about all of that dynamic, because that's a crazy dynamic.
Once he basically joined the U.S. team, the sky was the limit. And what we found ourselves was in he was a golden goose. And his value was that he had the entire picture from Colombia through Central America, into Mexico, and into the United States. He could put it all together for us. And that was that was a DEA agent's dream, was take down, dismantle from head to toe sophisticated, powerful, vicious cartels that were sending drugs throughout the world. So that's where we found ourselves, right in the heart of things. And he was a gold mine. And so we put him to work, and he made it clear from the get-go who the Colombians were that he could infiltrate, who the Mexicans were that he could infiltrate, and their distribution cells operating in the United States, all working to get drugs from Colombia and Mexico into the United States. And the dynamic was, what really helped in this case was he internalized the commitment and realized that it was all about changing his karma. He needed to change his karma. And at this point, and I saw it in his eyes at one point, he was completely sold on the fact that he was going down the wrong path and this was his opportunity to change. And he knew the dangers involved. The man had been involved in the drug business since the 80s.
Yeah, he had a man purse, and that's where you put the cameras. I was so impressed with that. Dealing with these brutal people, and he's got that camera. He put himself on the line big time for you guys and for himself and for his family.
He was gutsy. I can tell you this much, in the real world of the undercover DEA agent, we go undercover with short periods of time, during short periods of time. Most of the time when it involves drugs or money, we're going to have a rescue team nearby. And we're going to be wired. The informants, the juniors of the world don't have that. There was no rescue team standing by in Mexico or even in the United States. Well, when we were covering his meetings in the United States, we were close by. But when he's out of sight, definitely in another country, and in this case, he was in Mexico, he was in Panama, he was in Colombia, he was on his own. So if you excuse the expression, it was his balls and wits that kept him alive.
And throughout your book, that was it was amazing how he managed and acted, the quotes that you took. And I'm assuming that you remembered him because you had all the tapes. You knew what he said when he was talking to them. And he was like, oh, let's wait until we're, out of, he pretended like he was looking out for them. He deserves an Academy Award based on how he was playing each. He seemed very casual, very confident, very much not nervous, very trusting.
That was part of the reason why he was successful in the drug business. He was charming. He was charismatic. Mm-hmm. He was funny, and he he had leadership qualities. No, the qualities to his personality that enabled him to be an accomplished drug trafficker were the same personalities he put to work being a successful undercover agent of the government.
Yeah.
And but I have to say also that, and I'm sure you realize this in the book, is there was a lot of internal conflict going on with him because he was betraying those that he felt closest to in the drug world.
No, I mean, that absolutely came up, especially when he was having conversations and his compadres basically was supporting him, asking about his daughter who had passed away, like helping, them take the pressure off of him because, when shipments got lost or whatever, they were putting in a good word for him. And so, and Beto was like his brother. There was a line in the book where they call each other compadres or something, and there's a deeper meaning than what that, like, it's, you would take care of their family if something happened to them. It's like a brother. So it definitely, the stakes were in the book. I felt like I really understood the stakes based on how you wrote it. But let's look at, I know you don't want to give away the ending of the book, but I do want to give you and Junior and your team credit because according to your book, quote, takedown operations commenced in 2007 and ensued for over a decade. So this is from the work that you did with Junior, entailing law enforcement actions across the globe, including countries in Latin America and Europe. European counterparts successfully dismantled organized crime rings, working with both Colombians and Mexicans. Initial stages alone accounted for over 33 major drug traffickers, including cartel kingpins, being arrested, prosecuted, and sent to prison. Both foreign and domestic cartel cells were disrupted and dismantled. A total of 25 metric tons of cocaine were seized, while millions worth of assets were stripped from traffickers. The successes were attributed to what Junior had started in 2005. When you hear that, what do you think being a part of that?
It's it's enormous. But I want to say, I wrote the book, I wrote the story, Mike Chavarria, but it was not the Mike Chavarria show. Mm-hmm. This was a group effort, multiple offices, even agencies involved. Countries, host nation governments. There are a lot of people that went to work to make this thing happen. Panama, our guys in Panama and the Panamanians deserve a major hats off. So I attribute a lot of the success, not just to Junior, but all of the apparatus that went to work, taking Junior's information and turning it into operational opportunities. So yes, Junior started things out. Had it not been for Junior, we would not have gotten where we did. But Junior opened the door. Junior realized early on that his role was not only to develop incriminating information for us that would lead to successful prosecutions, but he was pointing us in the direction of the next cooperator. This is where DEA, the meat and potatoes of what we do, comes into play. So I tried to give an under the hood look at how we do our job internationally. Mm-hmm. And the bottom line, it's human sources. You're looking for the next rung on the ladder. Individuals can not only give you open more doors, but corroborate stuff you already have. Mm-hmm. So our whole goal was to identify, and in that 25 tons, those are seizures that had historically been made, right? Targeting the individuals that we were looking at, that enabled us to go back, develop prosecutable information that we could bring into the grand jury and get indictments. And during the entire process, as we went on with Junior, we realized there were 1, 2, 3, 4 individuals that we could recruit as informants, and they could continue to help us build the case. And that is why the case went on for so long. And then when we decided to take it down, it was really prompted by one of the cooperators who, got himself into a situation where the debts started to mount so much, it became a dangerous scenario for him to even be out walking free. He owed the traffickers well over $10 million. And as hard as he tried to make up for it, it just, spiraled downward. And so we had enough to start taking down significant individuals. But, many of them got into the wind and fugitated and went back to Colombia. But we started to find them, and we got them arrested, extradited, and prosecuted. And as far as the distribution cells operating in the United States, they were ready to go. We had already secured indictments, and those indictments were based on information, evidence that we obtained through the use of lawful wiretaps. And it was an extensive investigation. And like I said, there were many offices involved, from New York, southern parts of Texas, Houston, of course, Florida. And then we determined that much of the targets, cocaine, in this case, it was the Valencia organization. They call them the Millennial Cartel. They were sending a lot of cocaine over to Europe. And so we had an opportunity to infiltrate their operations in Europe. We seized some of that cocaine, and the counterparts, the European counterparts, further developed their investigation and revealed organized crime hands in the pie, so to speak, where they were working closely with Colombians as well as Mexicans. The investigation and operation Band of Brothers just continued to bloom. And so well after I transferred, Keith Bishop transferred, and the case continued to grow. But that's what we do with DEA.
And Junior got some really good karma in terms of like what he was able to help accomplish.
He certainly did.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so tell me the name of the book. Where can people find it?
Junior, a Son of the Gulf Cartel.
Okay.
Available on Amazon and anywhere books are sold. All you have to do is Google the book title, or you can look at my website, MikeChavarria.org, and my social media. I'm in social media on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn.
Well, before I let you go, I wanted to see if you had any insights into this former Olympic snowboarder who's now on the FBI's most wanted list and is believed to be being protected by the Sinaloa cartel. And this is kind of a crazy story. Do you have any thoughts on it?
I don't have any inside information, but I can assure you that, Canada is not so far north that, we don't have kingpin level traffickers. Now, are they at the level of Pablo Escobar, Chapo Guzman, Mayo Zambada, and, that? No. That's why he's being protected by the Sinaloa cartel, because he operated as a facilitator. And I'm sure it is very significant, or he would be on America's Most Wanted. And but I can say what I am aware of is that he was quite significant here for the amount of illicit drugs that are being trafficked between Mexico and Canada.
So when you say facilitator, is he like a broker, like what Junior? Or would you think that he was like a broker, like Junior? Is that what that means?
I think he oversaw his own organization, so he is much more than just a broker. He oversaw an organization and had control over distribution networks, moving money, laundering money. That wasn't Junior's role. That wasn't the role of at least Junior in my case. But this guy was more of a drug lord, a Canada-based drug lord who oversaw an organization.
Okay, so he's actually in Canada, but he's being protected by the Sinaloa cartel because he works with them. That's kind of...
I don't know where he physically is. I'm just saying, I know he's a Canadian.
Yeah.
And much of the investigation involved the Canadian authorities. Mm-hmm. And very likely he is in Mexico under the protection of the Sinaloa cartel, or at least the remnants of what's left of the Sinaloa cartel.
Okay. Well, Mike, thank you so much. It's been great talking to you. I will send you the episode when it's done. And it's been awesome.
Thank you. It's been my honor and pleasure to interact with you and for allowing me to share Junior's story with your audience.
Mm-hmm. I loved reading it. So great job. And I'm sure I'll talk to you again at some point.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay.
And we'll be watching you as well on your on your stories.
Well,
Fascinating.
thank you. Thank you. And tell your wife I said thank you so much. That means a lot. So, all
Thank you,
right.
ma'am.
Okay, bye.
Yes. Take care.
Up next, Criminal Mischief bonus content. Here, my co-host Brandon Morgan and I discuss the case in more detail. And as always, thanks for listening. From Pie in the Sky Media, Criminal Mischief is an EVO production, recorded live in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Brandon Morgan and myself, music by Soundstripe. For EVO Creative, I'm Carolyn Osorio, your writer and host.